Welcome to History Teller YT, the place where history speaks and the past comes alive. Today, we begin a journey through one of the most gripping and dangerous chapters of modern history, the Cold War. Imagine a world divided into two camps, the United States and its allies on one side, the Soviet Union and its satellites on the other. Nuclear missiles pointed at each other. Secret spies operating in shadows. Battles fought not only on warfields in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, but also in space, in culture, and in ideology. It was not a single war, but a clash of visions. Capitalism versus communism, freedom versus control, survival versus annihilation. We'll dive deep into every moment. The Berlin blockade, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, the space race, the rise and fall of leaders like Kennedy, Khrushchev, Reagan, and Gorbachev, and finally, the dramatic collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. This is not just politics. This is the story of humanity walking on the edge of destruction and somehow choosing survival. By the end of this journey, you'll see how the Cold War shaped the world we live in today. So, stay with me, because once you enter this story, you won't want to leave until the last page is turned. This is the Cold War. When World War II ended in 1945, much of Europe lay in ruins. Cities were reduced to rubble, millions were displaced, and entire economies had collapsed. In this environment, two superpowers rose to global dominance, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations had emerged victorious from the war, but they had done so with entirely different experiences and goals. The United States had suffered relatively little destruction at home and became the world's strongest industrial and military power. By contrast, the Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million people and seen its cities burned, yet it gained enormous influence across Eastern Europe after pushing back Nazi Germany. With Germany divided and Europe fragile, these two powers stood face to face, each determined to shape the post-war order according to its own vision. The U.S. promoted democracy, free markets, and liberal values, while the Soviet Union pursued a system of one-party rule and centralized command economy. This clash of visions set the stage for decades of tension, suspicion, and rivalry that became known as the Cold War. At the heart of the Cold War was an ideological struggle. The United States championed capitalism, which emphasized private ownership, individual freedoms, and open markets. Americans believed that prosperity and peace would spread if countries embraced free enterprise and democratic institutions. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, offered a radically different vision, communism. In this system, the state controlled the means of production, outlawed private property, and sought to eliminate class differences. To many in the USSR, communism promised equality, social justice, and liberation from imperialist exploitation. These two ideologies were not just competing economic systems. They were mutually exclusive worldviews that regarded each other as existential threats. For Washington, the expansion of communism threatened to enslave nations under dictatorship. For Moscow, the spread of capitalism meant exploitation and encirclement. This profound divide made cooperation difficult, even though the two nations had been wartime allies only months earlier. Suspicion quickly replaced unity, and by the late 1940s, the world was already split into two camps. The first test of this new rivalry came in Europe. Germany, once the aggressor, became the battleground for the Cold War's opening moves. After the war, the country was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, though deep inside Soviet territory, was also divided. Tensions quickly rose as the Western Allies pushed to rebuild Germany with a market economy, while the Soviets stripped resources from their zone and installed communist governments. In Eastern Europe, Stalin created a buffer zone of satellite states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and others, ruled by communist parties loyal to Moscow. To the west, this looked like aggression and expansionism. To Stalin, it was necessary protection against future invasions. The Truman Doctrine of 1947, pledging U.S. support for countries resisting communism, and the Marshall Plan, which poured billions into Europe's recovery, further widened the divide. What had started as wartime cooperation had hardened into a political, economic, and military standoff. The Cold War had officially begun. The first major confrontation of the Cold War erupted in Germany. In 1948, the United States, Britain, and France decided to merge their zones of occupied Germany into a single economic unit and introduce a new currency, the Deutsche Mark. They believed a strong, stable Germany was essential for European recovery. The Soviet Union, however, saw this as a threat. Stalin feared a resurgent Germany aligned with the West would undermine Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. In response, he ordered the blockade of West Berlin in June 1948. All rail, road, and canal access from the west into the city was cut off. Over 2 million West Berliners suddenly faced the possibility of starvation and energy shortages. Instead of retreating, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin Airlift, one of the largest humanitarian efforts in history. For almost a year, Allied planes flew around the clock, delivering food, coal, and supplies to the city. At its peak, aircraft were landing in Berlin every 45 seconds. Stalin eventually lifted the blockade in May 1949, realizing it had failed. The airlift was a stunning Western victory and a public relations disaster for Moscow. It showed the determination of the West to resist Soviet pressure, while giving Berlin symbolic importance as a frontline city of the Cold War. The Berlin crisis deepened mistrust and pushed the world into firm military alliances. In April 1949, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Its purpose was clear: to defend against Soviet aggression. The alliance declared that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all, creating a powerful collective security pact. For the first time in its history, the U.S. committed itself to a permanent peacetime alliance in Europe. In response, the Soviet Union tightened control over its satellite states. By 1955, it created its own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, which included the USSR and its Eastern European allies. Unlike NATO, where member states had some degree of independence, the Warsaw Pact was tightly controlled by Moscow. The division of Europe was now formalized, with NATO to the west and the Warsaw Pact to the east. The line that Winston Churchill had famously called the Iron Curtain was no longer just a metaphor. It had become a political and military reality. Troops, tanks, and nuclear weapons stood on either side, making Europe the most dangerous chessboard in the world. While alliances were forming, a far more terrifying competition began: the nuclear arms race. In 1945, the United States had demonstrated its devastating atomic power in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For 4 years, it held a monopoly on nuclear weapons, giving it immense strategic leverage. That changed in August 1949, when the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb, shocking Washington. The race escalated quickly. In 1952, the United States detonated the first hydrogen bomb, a weapon hundreds of times more powerful than the Hiroshima device. Within a year, the Soviet Union followed with its own hydrogen bomb. The logic of the arms race was brutal. If one side developed a new weapon, the other had to match or surpass it, no matter the cost. By the mid-1950s, both nations were producing thousands of warheads and perfecting delivery systems like long-range bombers. Later, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, made it possible to launch nuclear strikes across the globe in minutes. The result was a world living under constant threat of annihilation. Yet paradoxically, this danger also created a balance. The idea of mutually assured destruction, MAD, emerged. Neither side would dare start a nuclear war because it would guarantee their own destruction. Fear became a strange form of stability, locking the superpowers into a deadly stalemate that would last for decades. The first major shooting war of the Cold War broke out in East Asia. After World War II, Korea had been divided along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union occupied the north, installing a communist regime under Kim Il-sung, while the United States supported a capitalist government in the south led by Syngman Rhee. Both leaders dreamed of unifying the peninsula under their system. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, backed by Soviet equipment and later Chinese support, launched a surprise invasion of South Korea. Within weeks, they captured Seoul and pushed deep into the south. The United States, fearing the spread of communism and committed to containment, intervened under the banner of the United Nations. American and Allied forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, launched a bold amphibious landing at Incheon, cutting off North Korean supply lines and driving them back toward the Chinese border. But China entered the war in late 1950 with hundreds of thousands of troops, pushing UN forces back into bloody stalemate. The war raged for 3 years, with horrific casualties on both sides. Villages were destroyed, millions of Koreans were killed or displaced, and neither side gained a decisive advantage. In 1953, an armistice was signed, restoring the border near the 38th parallel. Technically, the two Koreas remain at war even today, since no peace treaty was ever signed. The Korean War demonstrated that the Cold War would not remain cold everywhere. It could erupt into devastating regional conflicts where ideology and superpower rivalry collided on the battlefield. While American soldiers fought in Korea, fear spread back home. The late 1940s and early 1950s saw the rise of the Red Scare, a period of intense suspicion and paranoia about communist infiltration in the United States. Politicians, journalists, Hollywood figures, and even ordinary citizens were accused of being spies or sympathizers. At the forefront was Senator Joseph McCarthy, who claimed he had lists of communists working inside the government. His aggressive investigations and public accusations created a climate of fear, where mere suspicion could ruin careers and reputations. Hundreds of government employees lost their jobs, and many artists, writers, and actors were blacklisted by the entertainment industry. Though some espionage cases, like the trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for allegedly passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, were real and sensational, McCarthy's methods often relied on intimidation and false charges. The Red Scare revealed how deeply Cold War tensions penetrated American society. Fear of communism was not just about foreign policy. It affected education, culture, and civil liberties. Dissent or criticism could easily be branded as un-American. By 1954, McCarthy's reckless tactics led to his downfall, but the damage had been done. The era left scars on American democracy, highlighting how ideological conflict abroad could fuel repression at home. Beneath the surface of open conflict, the Cold War was also a shadow war fought by spies, codebreakers, and secret agents. Both the United States and the Soviet Union relied heavily on intelligence agencies, the CIA in America and the KGB in the USSR, to gather information, conduct covert operations, and manipulate events abroad. The stakes were enormous. Each side wanted to know the other's nuclear secrets, military strategies, and political plans. In the late 1940s and 1950s, Soviet espionage penetrated deeply into Western institutions. Agents like Klaus Fuchs, who worked on the Manhattan Project, passed crucial atomic research to Moscow, helping accelerate the Soviet bomb program. At the same time, the United States sought to undermine communist governments and movements worldwide, supporting coups, propaganda campaigns, and underground resistance groups. Espionage became both a weapon and a symbol of Cold War paranoia. Spy scandals filled newspapers, while popular culture, from novels like John le Carre's to Hollywood thrillers, turned espionage into a defining feature of the era. This secret war blurred the lines between truth and deception as disinformation campaigns spread confusion. In many ways, the intelligence battle was as important as tanks and missiles because it shaped perceptions, influenced decisions, and fueled the distrust that kept the Cold War burning. Joseph Stalin's death in March 1953 marked a turning point in the Cold War. For nearly 3 decades, Stalin had ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist, creating a totalitarian state where fear and repression were constant. His leadership during World War II had elevated the USSR into a superpower, but his paranoia and brutality left deep scars on his people and his allies. After his death, a power struggle erupted among Soviet leaders, each maneuvering to inherit control of the world's largest communist empire. Eventually, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the dominant figure by 1955. Unlike Stalin, who had been rigid and ruthless, Khrushchev sought to portray himself as a more approachable and reform-minded leader. In his famous secret speech of 1956, he shocked the world by denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and exposing the crimes of his regime. This marked the beginning of de-Stalinization, a policy that promised reforms, greater openness, and some relaxation of the repressive system. Abroad, Khrushchev initially pursued a strategy of peaceful coexistence with the West, suggesting that communism and capitalism could compete without direct war. But his leadership style, impulsive, ambitious, and at times reckless, would soon push the Cold War into new, dangerous confrontations. Stalin's death opened the door for change, but it also unleashed instability as people across Eastern Europe tested the limits of Moscow's control. Even as Khrushchev tried to soften the image of the Soviet Union, the basic structure of the Eastern Bloc remained rigid and authoritarian. In 1955, the Soviets formalized their grip on Eastern Europe by creating the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance meant to counter NATO. The pact included Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania, placing their armed forces firmly under Soviet command. In reality, it was less about collective security and more about ensuring that Eastern Europe remained under Moscow's domination. The Soviet leadership feared that without military control, these nations might drift toward the West, especially as they witnessed the economic benefits of the Marshall Plan in Western Europe. Soviet troops were stationed across the region, and communist parties loyal to Moscow crushed opposition at home. For ordinary citizens in Eastern Europe, life meant limited freedoms, restricted travel, censorship, and political repression. Yet beneath the surface, discontent grew. Nationalism, resentment of Soviet occupation, and frustration with poor economic conditions made the region a powder keg. Khrushchev's talk of de-Stalinization raised hopes for reform, but when those hopes clashed with Soviet power, uprisings became inevitable. The Warsaw Pact was both a symbol of Soviet unity and a prison for the nations trapped behind the Iron Curtain. The first major test of Khrushchev's leadership came with the Hungarian uprising in 1956. Inspired by Khrushchev's criticism of Stalin and encouraged by reform movements in Poland, Hungarian students and workers began mass protests against their government, demanding political freedom, free elections, and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. The protests quickly escalated into a nationwide revolt. Crowds toppled statues of Stalin, armed civilians clashed with police, and a new government led by reformist Imre Nagy promised to introduce democratic changes. Most shocking of all, Nagy declared Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, signaling independence from Moscow. For a brief moment, it seemed that Hungary might break free from Soviet control. But Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership could not allow such defiance, fearing that if one country escaped, others would follow. In November 1956, the Soviet army launched a massive invasion with tanks and troops, crushing the uprising brutally. Thousands were killed, and tens of thousands fled as refugees to the west. Nagy was arrested and later executed. The Hungarian uprising revealed the harsh reality of the Cold War. Despite promises of reform, Moscow would never tolerate challenges to its dominance. It also exposed the limits of Western support. Though the United States condemned the Soviet action, it did not intervene militarily, unwilling to risk a direct war. For many in Eastern Europe, Hungary was a tragic lesson that resistance would be met with force. While for the world, it showed that the Cold War was not just about superpower rivalry, but also about the struggles of ordinary people caught between freedom and repression. In October 1957, the world woke up to a shocking beeping sound from space. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, into Earth's orbit. This small, metallic sphere weighed only 184 pounds, but its political and psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, humanity had placed an object in space, and it was not the United States that achieved this milestone, but its rival. Americans were stunned, feeling that Soviet science had leapt ahead. If Moscow could launch satellites, many feared it could also deliver nuclear warheads across the globe using the same rocket technology. The launch triggered widespread anxiety, especially as the Soviets soon followed with Sputnik 2, carrying the dog Laika, proving that living beings could survive in orbit. In the United States, the event sparked urgent reforms. Schools emphasized math and science education. Funding for research surged, and in 1958, NASA was created to lead the nation's space program. This space race had begun not just as a contest of technology, but as a symbol of ideological supremacy. Space became a new battlefield where the Cold War played out, a place where prestige, national pride, and global influence were on the line. For both superpowers, rockets and satellites were not only about exploration, but also about demonstrating the superiority of their system, capitalism or communism, to the entire world. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who took office in 1953, shaped America's Cold War policies during a critical period. A former World War II general, Eisenhower believed in maintaining strength while avoiding unnecessary wars. His administration emphasized containment of communism, but introduced new strategies. One was the doctrine of massive retaliation, which promised that any Soviet aggression would be met with overwhelming nuclear response. This approach aimed to deter Moscow by making the risks of war unacceptably high. It also reflected a belief that nuclear weapons were cheaper and more effective than maintaining large conventional armies. At the same time, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, promoted brinkmanship, the willingness to push dangerous situations to the edge of war to force the opponent to back down. While this policy kept the Soviets cautious, it also increased global anxiety. as each crisis risked spiraling in a nuclear conflict. Eisenhower also used covert operations through the CIA to influence events abroad, such as overthrowing governments in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954, to prevent communist influence. These methods revealed a more aggressive and secretive side of U.S. policy. Though Eisenhower avoided direct military confrontation with the Soviets, his strategies expanded the Cold War battlefield into Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. His presidency demonstrated the complexity of Cold War leadership, balancing the promise of peace with the constant threat of catastrophe. Just as the United States was preparing for a new phase of diplomacy with the Soviet Union, an intelligence disaster struck. For years, the U.S. had been flying high-altitude U-2 spy planes over Soviet territory to gather information about missile sites and military strength. These flights were considered crucial because the U.S. feared a missile gap, believing the Soviets might have more nuclear weapons than America. On May 1st, 1960, one such flight ended in disaster when a U-2 piloted by France's Gary Powers was shot down deep inside Soviet territory. The U.S. initially denied the mission, claiming it was a weather plane that had strayed off course. But the Soviets had captured both Powers alive and the wreckage of the plane, exposing the American lie. The incident embarrassed Washington and destroyed hopes for a major peace summit scheduled in Paris that same month. Khrushchev used the scandal to score propaganda points, demanding an apology, which Eisenhower refused to give. The U-2 crisis showed the fragility of Cold War diplomacy. Just one event could derail months of negotiation. It also highlighted the deep mistrust between the superpowers. Though both sides spoke of peace, espionage and suspicion continued to dominate their relationship. The skies, like space, had become another arena of the Cold War, where every move carried enormous risks. In the late 1950s, the small Caribbean island of Cuba became the stage for one of the most dramatic transformations of the Cold War. For decades, Cuba had been heavily influenced by the United States, both economically and politically. American companies controlled much of its sugar industry, while U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista ruled with corruption and repression. But in 1959, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro, along with his band of guerrillas, including the Argentine Marxist Che Guevara, overthrew Batista's regime after years of armed struggle. At first, many Cubans and even some Americans celebrated Castro as a hero who had liberated the country from dictatorship. However, Castro's government soon began nationalizing industries, redistributing land, and forging close ties with the Soviet Union. These actions alarmed Washington, which saw Cuba slipping from its sphere of influence into the communist camp, only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. For the Soviets, however, Cuba was a golden opportunity, a socialist ally in the Western Hemisphere, right under America's nose. The revolution marked the beginning of decades of tension between Havana and Washington. Castro's rise symbolized how the Cold War was not confined to Europe or Asia. It was spreading into Latin America, where ideology and superpower rivalry would collide with local struggles for independence and social justice. Cuba's alignment with Moscow transformed it into one of the most strategic and symbolic flashpoints of the entire Cold War. The United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower and later John F. Kennedy, was determined to prevent communism from taking root in Cuba. The CIA developed a plan to overthrow Castro by training and equipping Cuban exiles who had fled after the revolution. The scheme, inherited by Kennedy when he entered office in 1961, culminated in the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. In April, around 1,400 Cuban exiles landed on the southern coast of Cuba expecting to ignite a popular uprising against Castro. But the plan quickly fell apart. Cuban intelligence, with Soviet support, was well prepared. Castro's forces overwhelmed the invaders, killing or capturing most within days. Kennedy had refused to provide full U.S. military support, fearing international backlash, which left the exiles stranded and outgunned. The Bay of Pigs was a humiliating failure for Washington, making Kennedy appear weak and incompetent early in his presidency. For Castro, it was a triumph, solidifying his power at home and driving Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union. The fiasco also convinced Khrushchev that Kennedy was inexperienced and could be challenged aggressively on the world stage. The Bay of Pigs thus deepened the Cold War conflict, escalating tensions in the Western Hemisphere and setting the stage for an even more dangerous confrontation that would follow, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the Cold War reached its most dangerous moment, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. After the Bay of Pigs and continued U.S. hostility, Castro sought stronger protection from Moscow. Khrushchev responded by secretly placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, capable of striking nearly every major American city within minutes. When U.S. reconnaissance planes discovered the missile sites under construction, President Kennedy faced an agonizing decision. If he attacked Cuba, it might trigger a full-scale nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. If he did nothing, America's credibility and security would be undermined. Kennedy chose a middle path. He announced a naval quarantine around Cuba, preventing further Soviet shipments of missiles. For 13 tense days, the world watched as U.S. and Soviet ships faced off in the Caribbean, while military forces on both sides prepared for war. At one point, a single miscalculation could have unleashed global catastrophe. Finally, behind-the-scenes negotiations produced a deal. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade the island. Secretly, Washington also pledged to remove obsolete American missiles from Turkey, though this part of the agreement was not made public at the time. The crisis ended without war, but it left a profound impact. It showed how close the Cold War had come to nuclear annihilation and convinced both superpowers of the need for direct communication, leading to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline. For Kennedy, the resolution was seen as a victory. For Khrushchev, it was a setback that weakened his leadership. For the world, the Cuban Missile Crisis became a lasting symbol of Cold War danger, a reminder that human survival itself could hang on decisions made in secret rooms. Berlin remained one of the most volatile flashpoints of the Cold War. After World War II, the city had been divided into 4 occupation zones, but by the 1950s it was split into a capitalist West Berlin, backed by the United States and its allies, and a communist East Berlin under Soviet control. The contrast between the two sides was stark. West Berlin became a thriving showcase of Western prosperity, filled with consumer goods, cultural freedoms, and economic growth. East Berlin, like the rest of East Germany, suffered from shortages, strict censorship, and limited opportunities. As a result, millions of East Germans fled through Berlin to the west, seeking better lives. By 1961, more than 2.5 million people had escaped, threatening the survival of the East German regime. To stop the exodus, Soviet-backed East Germany suddenly built a barrier in August 1961. Overnight, barbed wire and concrete walls went up, dividing families, neighborhoods, and even streets. The Berlin Wall became the most visible symbol of the Cold War, a physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain. Armed guards patrolled the wall, and anyone attempting to cross was shot. For the West, the wall was a tragedy, proof of communist failure, while for the East, it was portrayed as a protective measure against Western aggression. President John F. Kennedy, though unable to prevent the wall's construction, visited Berlin in 1963 and declared in his famous speech, "Ich bin ein Berliner," expressing solidarity with the city's people. The wall stood for nearly 3 decades, not only dividing Berlin, but also symbolizing the division of the entire world into 2 hostile camps. Its presence reminded everyone that the Cold War was not just about abstract politics. It shaped the daily lives and freedoms of millions. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had brought humanity dangerously close to nuclear annihilation. Both Washington and Moscow realized that unchecked escalation could destroy the planet. Out of this sobering realization came one of the first major arms control agreements of the Cold War, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. Negotiated between the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, the treaty prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. While underground testing continued, the treaty was a step toward reducing radioactive fallout and limiting the nuclear arms race. For President Kennedy, who had faced the terrifying responsibility of managing the missile crisis, the treaty was a personal triumph and a moment of hope in an otherwise hostile era. For Khrushchev, it offered a way to stabilize relations after his humiliation during the Cuban crisis. Yet the treaty was limited in scope. France and China, 2 emerging nuclear powers, refused to sign, and the US and USSR continued building vast arsenals. Still, the Test Ban Treaty represented an important shift. Even in the midst of bitter rivalry, the superpowers recognized the need for cooperation to avoid mutual destruction. It laid the groundwork for future arms control agreements, showing that diplomacy was possible, even in the shadow of nuclear competition. For ordinary people, it provided a rare moment of relief, proof that the leaders of the world's 2 most dangerous nations could take steps, however small, toward peace. On November 22, 1963, the world was stunned when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. His death sent shockwaves across the globe, and its impact on the Cold War was immediate. Kennedy had been a central figure in Cold War diplomacy, facing down Khrushchev in Berlin, navigating the Cuban Missile Crisis, and beginning steps toward nuclear restraint. His speeches had inspired millions with calls for freedom and peace, such as his Berlin address and his American University speech advocating for a more cooperative world. His assassination created uncertainty at a dangerous time. Many wondered if the Soviet Union or Cuba had been involved, given the intense hostility between Washington and those governments. Though investigations eventually concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, the climate of suspicion deepened Cold War tensions. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, inherited both the nuclear rivalry and the escalating conflict in Vietnam. While Kennedy had managed to avoid full-scale war with the Soviets, his death removed a leader who had shown both resolve and flexibility in the Cold War's most dangerous moments. Around the world, even in Moscow, there was genuine grief. Khrushchev reportedly wept when he learned of Kennedy's death, recognizing that he had lost a negotiating partner who might have steered the Cold War toward a more stable course. The assassination not only changed American politics, but also left a sense of lost possibilities in the global struggle between East and West. Vietnam became one of the longest and bloodiest proxy wars of the Cold War. After World War II, the country was divided into 2. The Communist North led by Ho Chi Minh and the anti-Communist South under Ngo Dinh Diem, backed heavily by the United States. To Washington, Vietnam was not just a local conflict. It was a test of containment. American leaders feared that if South Vietnam fell to communism, Other countries in Asia would follow in what became known as the domino theory. Under President Kennedy, the U.S. sent military advisors and financial aid. But after Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson escalated the conflict dramatically. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where U.S. naval ships were allegedly attacked by North Vietnamese forces, gave Johnson the justification to send combat troops. By 1965, American soldiers were fighting directly, and by the late 1960s, more than 500,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam. The war was brutal and unconventional. The Viet Cong, communist guerrillas in the South, used ambushes, tunnels, and booby traps to frustrate the technologically superior U.S. forces. The dense jungles, unfamiliar terrain, and lack of clear front lines made victory elusive. Villages were bombed, forests were destroyed with chemicals like Agent Orange, and civilians often found themselves caught in the crossfire. What was supposed to be a quick intervention turned into a grinding, unwinnable war that drained American resources and tested its national resolve. Vietnam showed how Cold War ideology could drag a superpower into a devastating conflict far from home, with consequences that would ripple across the globe. In January 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year known as Tet, communist forces launched a massive surprise offensive across South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive was coordinated by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, striking over 100 cities and military bases, including the capital, Saigon. Though the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the attacks and inflicted heavy casualties on the communists, the psychological impact was profound. The offensive showed that the enemy was far from defeated despite years of American escalation and optimistic government reports. Images of fierce street battles, the U.S. Embassy in Saigon under attack, and shocking footage of civilian suffering were broadcast into American living rooms through television. For the first time, many Americans questioned whether the war was winnable or even worth fighting. The U.S. military declared the offensive a tactical victory, since they held their ground, but politically it was a disaster. Public trust in the government eroded, and anti-war voices grew louder. President Johnson, once determined to see the war through, announced he would not seek re-election, a sign of how deeply the conflict had shaken the United States. Globally, the Tet Offensive was seen as proof that the mightiest military in the world could be humbled by a determined, resourceful enemy. It marked a turning point in the Vietnam War and in the broader Cold War narrative, as America's credibility and moral authority suffered a serious blow. As the Vietnam War dragged on, opposition grew not only in the United States, but also around the world. In America, college campuses erupted with protests. Students organized massive demonstrations, burned draft cards, and chanted slogans like, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" The movement drew in civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., who condemned the war as a moral outrage and criticized how money was being spent on bombs abroad while poverty persisted at home. Images of napalm-burned children and atrocities like the My Lai massacre, where U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of civilians, fueled outrage. The anti-war sentiment also spread internationally, with protests erupting in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The Vietnam conflict became a symbol of Cold War injustice, where superpower rivalry devastated a smaller nation caught in between. Even within the U.S. government, divisions deepened as military leaders clashed with civilian policymakers. The war eroded America's reputation as a champion of freedom, making it appear instead as an aggressor enforcing its will on a distant land. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and China provided support to North Vietnam, portraying themselves as allies of liberation movements worldwide. For many in the developing world, Vietnam became a rallying cry against imperialism. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the war had become not just a military conflict, but a global symbol of resistance and protest. The anti-war movement underscored how the Cold War was not fought only on battlefields, but also in the hearts and minds of ordinary people who demanded peace, justice, and accountability. In 1968, Eastern Europe witnessed one of its most hopeful yet tragic moments of the Cold War, the Prague Spring. In Czechoslovakia, reformist leader Alexander Dubček came to power with promises of creating socialism with a human face. Unlike the rigid Stalinist model, Dubček sought to introduce political freedoms, loosen censorship, and allow more economic independence while keeping the country within the socialist camp. His reforms electrified the nation. Newspapers published bold criticism of the government. Students demanded even more liberties, and citizens filled the streets with optimism. For a brief moment, it seemed that a communist country could pursue both socialism and democracy. But the Soviet Union, under Leonid Brezhnev, saw this as a direct threat to its control of Eastern Europe. If Czechoslovakia broke free, others might follow. In August 1968, the Soviets, along with Warsaw Pact allies, invaded with hundreds of thousands of troops and tanks, crushing the Prague Spring. Dubček was arrested, reforms were reversed, and strict communist rule was reimposed. The invasion shocked the world, especially the West, but the United States, mired in Vietnam, offered only condemnation without action. For the Soviet Union, the Prague Spring was a lesson in preserving dominance, leading to the Brezhnev Doctrine, which declared that Moscow had the right to intervene in any socialist country where communism was threatened. For the people of Eastern Europe, it was a bitter reminder that freedom and reform would be met with military force. The Prague Spring symbolized both the yearning for liberty and the harsh reality of Cold War oppression. By the late 1960s, the United States was deeply fatigued by Vietnam, social unrest, and economic strain. When Richard Nixon became president in 1969, he sought to recalibrate America's Cold War strategy. His approach became known as the Nixon Doctrine, which emphasized that while the U.S. would honor existing commitments, it expected its allies to take greater responsibility for their own defense. This policy reflected a desire to reduce direct American military involvement abroad, especially after the Vietnam quagmire. Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, also introduced the concept of détente, a relaxation of tensions with both the Soviet Union and China. Unlike earlier presidents who had pursued Cold War competition in almost every sphere, Nixon recognized the need for balance and pragmatic engagement. He shocked the world by reaching out to Mao Zedong's China, visiting Beijing in 1972 and beginning a new era of Sino-American relations. At the same time, he pursued negotiations with the Soviet Union, seeking to manage the arms race and reduce the risks of nuclear confrontation. Nixon's strategy did not mean abandoning competition. He still sought to maintain U.S. strength, but it introduced a more flexible approach. Détente represented a turning point. The Cold War was no longer defined solely by hostility, but also by cautious cooperation, where superpowers acknowledged their mutual interest in avoiding catastrophic war. One of the most significant achievements of Nixon's policy of détente was the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT-I. For decades, the arms race had spiraled upward, with both the U.S. and the Soviet Union amassing thousands of nuclear warheads and increasingly advanced delivery systems. The threat of mutually assured destruction, MAD, loomed over the globe. In 1969, negotiations began between the two superpowers to place limits on their nuclear arsenals. After years of tense discussions, the SALT-I agreements were signed in Moscow in 1972. The accords included two key elements: the Anti-Ballistic Missile (ABM) Treaty, which limited the deployment of systems designed to shoot down nuclear missiles, and the Interim Agreement that froze the number of certain types of strategic weapons. While SALT-I did not reduce nuclear stockpiles, it was the first step in restraining the arms race and acknowledged the need for arms control. For Nixon, it was a diplomatic victory that showed his ability to balance strength with negotiation. For the Soviet Union, it offered recognition as an equal superpower, a validation of its global status. SALT-I gave the world a rare sense of progress in a dangerous nuclear rivalry. Yet critics argued it merely froze existing inequalities as the U.S. retained technological advantages. Still, the agreement marked the beginning of a new phase in the Cold War, one where negotiation and diplomacy could coexist with competition, and where the survival of humanity demanded cooperation, even between bitter enemies. The Middle East became another battleground where the Cold War played out through local wars and shifting alliances. The Yom Kippur War of 1973 was a stark example. On October 6th, during the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack against Israel, aiming to regain territories lost in the Six-Day War of 1967. Initially, Arab forces made significant advances, crossing the Suez Canal and pushing into the Golan Heights. Israel, however, quickly regrouped with massive American military support, receiving weapons, supplies, and airlifts from Washington. This aid helped Israel turn the tide, surrounding the Egyptian Third Army and pushing Syrian forces back. For the Soviet Union, which supported Egypt and Syria with weapons and advisors, the war was an opportunity to counter U.S. influence in the region. As both superpowers rushed supplies to their allies, the conflict risked escalating into a direct U.S. Soviet confrontation. At one point, the U.S. raised its nuclear alert status to DEFCON 3, the highest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Though a ceasefire was eventually brokered by the United Nations and enforced by both Washington and Moscow, the war left lasting consequences. It reshaped Middle Eastern politics, spurred Egypt's eventual shift toward the U.S., and demonstrated how dangerous Cold War competition could be when mixed with regional conflicts fueled by nationalism, religion, and territorial disputes. The Yom Kippur War had another global consequence: the oil crisis of 1973. In response to U.S. and Western support for Israel, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, declared an oil embargo against nations allied with Israel. The results were immediate and dramatic. Oil prices quadrupled. Gasoline shortages spread across the United States and Europe, and economies that depended on cheap energy fell into recession. Long lines at gas stations, rationing, and rising inflation became everyday realities. The oil shock highlighted the vulnerability of industrialized nations to the politics of the Middle East. For the Soviet Union, the crisis was a mixed blessing. As a major oil producer itself, Moscow profited from higher prices, but also faced challenges in managing alliances with Arab states while maintaining influence over global communism. The oil crisis reshaped international relations, pushing Western nations to reconsider energy policies, invest in alternative sources, and strengthen ties with oil producers. It also showed how Cold War politics could intertwine with economic vulnerabilities, as actions in one region could ripple across the entire globe. For ordinary people, the oil crisis brought the Cold War into their daily lives, reminding them that the struggle between superpowers was not just fought in distant lands, but could also affect whether they could drive their cars, heat their homes, or afford basic necessities. Amid crises, the mid-1970s also brought a surprising moment of diplomatic progress. In 1975, representatives from 35 nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union, gathered in Finland to sign the Helsinki Accords. The agreement had three main pillars: recognition of existing European borders, economic and technological cooperation, and commitments to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. For the Soviets, the Accords were a victory in some ways, as they legitimized post-World War II borders and confirmed Moscow's control over Eastern Europe. But the human rights provisions would come back to haunt them. Dissidents and activists in Eastern Europe seized upon the language of the Accords to demand greater freedoms and accountability from their governments. Groups such as Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia and other underground movements used the Accords as a moral weapon against repression. In the United States, the Accords sparked debate. Critics argued that Washington had effectively recognized Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe, while supporters praised the agreement as a step toward reducing tensions. The Helsinki process reflected the broader spirit of détente, where superpowers tried to manage competition through dialogue and compromise. It had also revealed the paradox of the Cold War. Even as leaders signed agreements, ideological battles over freedom and human rights continued to simmer beneath the surface. The Accords highlighted that the Cold War was not just about nuclear weapons and geopolitics, but also about values, ideals, and the dignity of individuals trapped behind the Iron Curtain. In December 1979, the Cold War entered a dangerous new chapter when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The country, strategically located at the crossroads of Central and South Asia, had long been unstable, plagued by tribal rivalries, weak governments, and poverty. In the late 1970s, Afghanistan was ruled by a communist government that had seized power through a coup in 1978. Known as the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PPA, the regime attempted to impose radical reforms, including land redistribution, secularization, and modernization. But these policies clashed with Afghanistan's deeply traditional and religious society, sparking fierce resistance. Rebellion spread across the countryside, fueled by conservative tribal leaders, Islamic clerics, and disaffected groups. Fearing that the communist government might collapse, Moscow decided to intervene directly. On December 24, 1979, tens of thousands of Soviet troops poured across the border, assassinated Afghan leader Hafizullah Amin, and installed a more reliable ally, Babruk Karmal. The invasion shocked the world. For the United States and its allies, it was proof that the Soviets were still aggressively expanding their influence, despite the era of détente. The invasion was often described as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a costly, bloody conflict in a foreign land that would drain resources and morale. Afghanistan, once a relatively peripheral player, now became a central battlefield of the Cold War, where global superpower rivalry collided with local struggles for identity, religion, and independence. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan marked the end of détente and revived intense Cold War hostilities. President Jimmy Carter, who had initially hoped for a more cooperative relationship with Moscow, responded with swift and decisive measures. In 1980, he announced the Carter Doctrine, which declared that any attempt by an outside power to control the Persian Gulf region would be viewed as an assault on U.S. vital interests and would be repelled by military force if necessary. This policy signaled America's determination to protect oil supplies and resist Soviet advances in the Middle East and South Asia. The U.S. also imposed economic sanctions on the Soviet Union, restricted grain sales, and boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. But perhaps the most significant response was covert. Through the CIA, Washington began funneling money, weapons, and training to the Afghan resistance, known as the Mujahideen. Pakistan, under General Zia-ul-Haq, became a critical conduit for this aid, serving as a staging ground for guerrilla fighters. Saudi Arabia also contributed, framing the Afghan struggle as a jihad against atheistic communism. These efforts turned Afghanistan into a proxy war, where Soviet troops fought not just Afghan rebels, but a global coalition supported by Western and Islamic states. For Carter, the invasion confirmed the aggressive nature of the Soviet Union and reshaped U.S. foreign policy. It marked the beginning of a new phase of confrontation, where the Middle East and Central Asia became increasingly important arenas in the Cold War chessboard. The Soviet war in Afghanistan soon became a nightmare. The Mujahideen fighters, motivated by religion, nationalism, and the defense of their homeland, proved to be resilient and resourceful opponents. Armed with weapons supplied by the U.S. and its allies, including advanced Stinger missiles that could shoot down Soviet helicopters, they inflicted heavy casualties on the Soviet army. Afghanistan's rugged mountains and deserts provided perfect terrain for guerrilla warfare, allowing small bands of fighters to strike and disappear. Soviet forces, despite their overwhelming firepower, struggled to control the countryside and found themselves bogged down in a war of attrition. For the Afghan people, the cost was catastrophic. Villages were bombed, millions fled as refugees to Pakistan and Iran, and the country was left devastated by violence. Internationally, the war became a rallying cry. Across the Muslim world, volunteers traveled to Afghanistan to join the jihad, seeing it as a sacred struggle against communism. The conflict also deepened global polarization, as the West portrayed the Mujahideen as freedom fighters resisting tyranny, while the Soviets depicted them as terrorists and foreign puppets. The war dragged on throughout the 1980s, bleeding Soviet resources and morale. Ultimately, it contributed to the weakening of the Soviet Union itself, as the costs mounted and public support eroded at home. Yet the consequences extended beyond the Cold War. The networks of fighters, weapons, and ideologies that emerged in Afghanistan would later reshape global politics, giving birth to new forms of militant extremism. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was thus not only a turning point in the Cold War, but also a prelude to conflicts that would continue long after the superpowers' rivalry ended. When Ronald Reagan became President of the United States in January 1981, he inherited a Cold War that had intensified following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Unlike his predecessors who had experimented with détente and cautious diplomacy, Reagan brought a confrontational, unapologetically hardline stance against communism. He believed the United States had been too passive in the 1970s, allowing the Soviet Union to expand its influence globally. Reagan's worldview was deeply shaped by his conviction that communism was not just a rival system, but an evil ideology that had to be defeated. His administration quickly ramped up defense spending, launching one of the largest peacetime military buildups in U.S. history. Billions of dollars were poured into new weapons systems, nuclear missiles, aircraft, and naval forces. He also strengthened America's alliances, ensuring NATO remained united and ready to counter Soviet advances in Europe. Reagan rejected the notion of peaceful coexistence as a permanent arrangement. Instead, he spoke openly about achieving victory in the Cold War by applying relentless pressure on the Soviet Union, economically, militarily, and ideologically. His election marked a turning point where the Cold War once again shifted toward open confrontation, raising fears of renewed global conflict, but also energizing those who opposed Soviet domination. In March 1983, Reagan delivered a speech that would become one of the most iconic statements of the Cold War. Speaking to a group of evangelical Christians, he denounced the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the modern world, and famously called it an evil empire. This rhetoric electrified his supporters, but also alarmed critics who feared it would increase tensions and make diplomacy impossible. To Reagan, however, blunt moral clarity was essential. He framed the Cold War not just as a geopolitical rivalry, but as a battle between good and evil, freedom and tyranny. His words resonated deeply in Eastern Europe, where dissidents and oppressed citizens drew strength from the idea that the world's most powerful democracy openly condemned their oppressors. But in Moscow, the speech was received as a provocation, reinforcing the Soviet leadership's view that the U.S. was bent on confrontation. Reagan's tough words were matched by actions. His administration supported anti-communist movements and insurgencies across the globe, from Central America to Africa and Asia, under what became known as the Reagan Doctrine. This policy aimed to roll back Soviet influence by aiding groups fighting communist governments, such as the Contras in Nicaragua and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The combination of fiery rhetoric and aggressive policy made the early 1980s one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War, as both superpowers braced for potential escalation. Reagan's willingness to take risks, however, also set the stage for dramatic changes in the years to come. Perhaps the most ambitious and controversial aspect of Reagan's Cold War strategy was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, announced in 1983. Quickly nicknamed Star Wars by critics, the plan envisioned a futuristic missile defense system that could protect the United States from nuclear attack. Using space-based lasers, satellites, and advanced interceptors, SDI aimed to render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. While the technology was largely theoretical and far beyond what was possible at the time, the announcement sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union. For decades, the balance of power had been based on mutually assured destruction, MAD, the idea that neither side would launch a nuclear strike because it guaranteed their own destruction. If the U.S. could truly defend itself against missiles, it would upset this delicate balance, giving Washington a decisive advantage. The Soviets, already struggling with a stagnant economy and the costs of maintaining military parity, feared they could not keep up with the technological race. While many scientists and politicians in the U.S. doubted SDI's feasibility, Reagan's commitment to the project demonstrated his willingness to think beyond traditional strategies. It was not just about technology, but also psychology. SDI put enormous pressure on Moscow, forcing the Soviets to divert resources into defense at a time when their system was already under strain. In the long run, SDI contributed to the mounting economic and political challenges that would weaken the Soviet Union. For Reagan, it embodied his bold approach, high stakes, visionary, and determined to change the rules of the Cold War game. By the early 1980s, the cracks in the Soviet system were beginning to show most clearly in Eastern Europe. Nowhere was this more evident than in Poland. In 1980, a workers' strike at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk gave birth to an independent trade union known as Solidarity, Solidarność, led by the charismatic electrician Lech Walesa. What began as a protest over wages and working conditions quickly transformed into a massive social and political movement demanding greater freedoms, human rights, and independence from Soviet control. Solidarity attracted millions of members from across Polish society, workers, intellectuals, and even elements of the Catholic Church, which played a vital role under the leadership of Pope John Paul II, himself Polish. The movement terrified the communist authorities and alarmed Moscow, which feared losing its grip on one of the largest and most strategically important states in Eastern Europe. In 1981, Poland's communist government, under General Wojciech Jaruzelski, declared martial law, arrested Solidarity leaders, and attempted to crush the movement. Yet Solidarity survived underground, supported by Western governments, particularly the United States, which provided financial and moral backing. For the Soviets, the Polish crisis was deeply troubling. Unlike Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968, a full-scale military intervention was too risky, given global attention and internal strains. Solidarity symbolized the growing resistance within the Eastern Bloc, proving that communism was not invincible. The movement's endurance inspired others across the region and foreshadowed the eventual collapse of Soviet dominance. Poland became the first domino in a chain of uprisings that would eventually reshape all of Europe. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was facing profound challenges. Its economy was stagnating, burdened by inefficiency, corruption, and the costs of maintaining military parity with the United States. Agriculture lagged behind, consumer goods were scarce, and technological innovation trailed far behind the West. Meanwhile, the war in Afghanistan drained resources and morale, while political dissent simmered at home and abroad. In 1985, after the deaths of 3 elderly leaders in quick succession, Brezhnev in 1982, Andropov in 1984, and Chernenko in early 1985, the Soviet Communist Party turned to a younger, energetic figure, Mikhail Gorbachev. At just 54, Gorbachev represented a new generation. Unlike his predecessors, he recognized that the Soviet Union could not survive without fundamental change. He was articulate, pragmatic, and willing to challenge old orthodoxies. Gorbachev sought to revitalize socialism through reform rather than dismantle it entirely. His arrival signaled a new era in Soviet politics, one that would dramatically alter the course of the Cold War. The West initially greeted him with suspicion, but also curiosity. Could this man be different from the rigid, hostile Soviet leaders of the past? In time, Gorbachev's leadership would transform not only his country, but also the entire global balance of power. His vision would clash with entrenched interests in Moscow, but his boldness and willingness to experiment marked him as one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century. To address the Soviet Union's deepening crisis, Gorbachev introduced 2 revolutionary policies: glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. Glasnost encouraged greater transparency, freedom of speech, and openness in government institutions. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens could openly criticize corruption, discuss social problems, and even read previously banned literature. State censorship was relaxed, and the media began covering topics that had long been suppressed, from environmental disasters to Stalinist purges. Perestroika, on the other hand, aimed to restructure the Soviet economy. Gorbachev sought to introduce limited market mechanisms into the rigid command system, giving factories more autonomy, encouraging private enterprise in small sectors, and promoting efficiency. These reforms were intended to strengthen socialism, not abandon it, but they unleashed forces Gorbachev could not fully control. Glasnost opened the door to demands for greater democracy and autonomy, not just in the USSR, but across Eastern Europe. Perestroika, meanwhile, created confusion and shortages as old systems collapsed faster than new ones took shape. For the West, Gorbachev's policies were both astonishing and encouraging. Here was a Soviet leader who spoke of cooperation, peace, and reform rather than confrontation. For hardliners in Moscow, however, his reforms seemed like dangerous concessions that threatened the very survival of the communist system. By the late 1980s, glasnost and perestroika had fundamentally changed the Soviet Union, weakening the rigid structures that had held it together for decades. These seeds of reform would grow into forces that neither Gorbachev nor anyone else could fully control, eventually leading to the dramatic collapse of the Soviet Empire. In October 1986, U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev met in Reykjavik, Iceland, for what was initially intended to be a modest discussion about arms control. What unfolded instead was one of the most remarkable and dramatic encounters of the Cold War. The two leaders, coming from starkly different backgrounds and ideologies, surprised their advisors by engaging in candid, extended conversations about reducing nuclear weapons. At one point, they even came close to agreeing on the total elimination of nuclear arsenals, something unimaginable only a few years earlier. Yet the talks ultimately broke down over a single sticking point: Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, his ambitious plan for a space-based missile defense system. Gorbachev demanded that SDI be limited to laboratory research, fearing it would give the U.S. a decisive strategic advantage. But Reagan refused, insisting that SDI was a defensive measure. Despite the collapse of the summit, Reykjavik was a turning point. It demonstrated that both superpowers were willing to consider radical reductions in their nuclear stockpiles and showed that personal diplomacy could cut through decades of hostility. The near breakthrough created momentum for future agreements, proving that the once unthinkable serious nuclear disarmament was now on the table. Reykjavik may have ended without a treaty, but it transformed the trajectory of Cold War diplomacy, planting seeds that would soon bear fruit. Following the intense but ultimately unsuccessful Reykjavik talks, Reagan and Gorbachev continued negotiations, determined not to let the opportunity slip away. Their efforts culminated in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF, Treaty signed in Washington in December 1987. The INF Treaty was groundbreaking in several ways. It was the first arms control agreement that not only limited but actually eliminated an entire category of nuclear weapons. Both the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to destroy all of their intermediate range and shorter range missiles, totaling nearly 2,700 weapons. More importantly, the treaty included unprecedented verification measures, allowing inspectors from each side to monitor compliance directly. This level of transparency was revolutionary in a relationship that had long been built on secrecy and suspicion. For Reagan, the treaty was a triumph that validated his belief in negotiating from a position of strength. For Gorbachev, it showcased his willingness to embrace reform and cooperation with the West. The signing ceremony, filled with symbolic gestures and smiles, was broadcast worldwide, offering hope that the nuclear arms race might finally be curbed. Critics on both sides argued that their leaders had given away too much, but the INF Treaty became a landmark of Cold War diplomacy. It demonstrated that the superpowers could step back from the brink and work together to reduce the most dangerous weapons humanity had ever created. The agreement marked a high point of détente in the 1980s and signaled a dramatic shift in the Cold War dynamic. While Gorbachev pursued reforms and arms control abroad, the Soviet Union's control over its Eastern European satellites was rapidly eroding. Glasnost and Perestroika had created expectations of freedom and change not only within the USSR, but also across the Eastern Bloc. In countries like Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia, dissident movements gained new strength. Independent newspapers and underground organizations flourished, inspired by Gorbachev's call for openness. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev signaled that he would not use overwhelming force to crush uprisings in Eastern Europe, effectively undermining the Brezhnev Doctrine that had justified Soviet interventions in Hungary, 1956, and Czechoslovakia, 1968. This new approach, sometimes called the Sinatra Doctrine, jokingly referring to the song My Way, meant that Eastern European nations were increasingly free to determine their own paths. For communist governments in the region, this was destabilizing, as they could no longer rely on Moscow's tanks to enforce their rule. For opposition movements, it was liberating. By the late 1980s, demonstrations for democracy and reform grew bolder, and whispers of independence spread across the Warsaw Pact states. The Soviet Union, once feared as an unstoppable enforcer, now appeared hesitant and weakened. Gorbachev's reforms, intended to save socialism, instead opened the door to a wave of revolutions that would soon sweep Eastern Europe. The weakening Soviet grip on its satellites was one of the clearest signs that the Cold War was moving toward a dramatic and unforeseen conclusion. By 1989, the Cold War structure was collapsing in Eastern Europe at a breathtaking pace. For decades, the Soviet Union had maintained its grip over its satellite states through military might, political control, and the threat of intervention. But Gorbachev's reforms and his decision to abandon the Brezhnev Doctrine created a radically different reality. Without the guarantee of Soviet tanks to prop them up, communist governments across Eastern Europe suddenly found themselves vulnerable to their own citizens' demands for freedom. The first cracks appeared in Poland, where the Solidarity movement, legalized again in 1989, negotiated free elections with the communist government. In June, Solidarity candidates won a landslide victory, forming the first non-communist-led government in the Eastern Bloc. This electrified the region. In Hungary, reformers dismantled border fences with Austria, opening the Iron Curtain and allowing thousands of East Germans to escape to the west. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution, a peaceful movement led by Václav Havel and student activists, brought down the communist regime without bloodshed. In Bulgaria, protests forced the resignation of longtime leader Todor Zhivkov. Even in Romania, where Nicolae Ceausescu attempted to cling to power with violence, the people rose up and he and his wife were executed after a swift revolution. Across the region, decades of repression collapsed in a matter of months. The revolutions of 1989 were remarkable for their speed and largely peaceful nature, showing how quickly an empire that once seemed unshakable could unravel. The Cold War order in Europe was disintegrating before the world's eyes. The most dramatic and symbolic moment of 1989 came in Berlin, the city that had been the heart of Cold War division since the 1940s. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, had stood for 28 years as a physical and psychological barrier between East and West, communism and capitalism, repression and freedom. But by the late 1980s, East Germany was in crisis. Mass protests erupted in Leipzig and other cities, demanding reform and free elections. Tens of thousands of citizens fled through Hungary and Czechoslovakia once those borders opened, exposing the regime's weakness. East German leader Erich Honecker, a hardliner, resigned in October 1989, replaced by Egon Krenz, who promised reforms but could not stem the tide of discontent. On November 9th, after weeks of growing demonstrations and a confused government announcement, East German authorities opened the border. Crowds surged to the checkpoints, and guards, uncertain of what to do, let people pass freely. In a matter of hours, Berliners from both sides climbed atop the wall, celebrated, and began dismantling it with hammers and bare hands. The images of joyful crowds tearing down the wall were broadcast worldwide, instantly becoming a symbol of liberation. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than just the end of a barrier. it was the collapse of an entire system. It signaled the death of the East German regime and, more broadly, the disintegration of Soviet control in Eastern Europe. For millions, it was the moment when the impossible dream of freedom became reality. For the world, it marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall accelerated the unraveling of communist regimes throughout Eastern Europe. In quick succession, governments that had seemed immovable for decades fell one after another. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution brought playwright Václav Havel to power as president, transforming the country into a democracy almost overnight. In Bulgaria, longtime communist leader Todor Zhivkov was ousted, and reforms soon followed. In Romania, the most violent of the revolutions occurred. Dictator Nicolae Ceausescu attempted to suppress protests with deadly force, but the army and public turned against him. He and his wife were captured, tried, and executed on December 25, 1989, in scenes that shocked the world. These revolutions did not just topple governments. They dismantled the very structures of Soviet influence that had defined Europe since World War II. Gorbachev, consistent with his policy of non-intervention, refused to use military force to save these regimes, a decision that allowed the transformations to unfold, but also exposed the Soviet Union's growing weakness. For the people of Eastern Europe, 1989 was a year of liberation and rebirth, as centuries of foreign domination and decades of communist dictatorship gave way to democracy and national independence. For the Cold War, it was a decisive moment. The Soviet Empire in Europe was gone, and the ideological battle between East and West was tilting decisively toward the West. The revolutions of 1989 demonstrated that the power of people united for freedom could topple even the mightiest of systems. Few events symbolized the end of the Cold War more powerfully than the reunification of Germany. For nearly half a century, Germany had been divided. West Germany aligned with NATO and the capitalist West, while East Germany was a member of the Warsaw Pact under strict Soviet influence. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the collapse of the East German state. Millions of East Germans voted with their feet, fleeing westward or demanding immediate reforms. In March 1990, East Germany held its first free elections, and pro-reunification parties won a decisive victory. Negotiations quickly began between West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, East German leaders, the four Allied powers of World War II, the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union, and other European partners. The challenge was immense. Merging two countries with vastly different political systems, economies, and societies. But the momentum of history was unstoppable. On October 3rd, 1990, Germany officially reunified, with Berlin restored as the capital. For Germans, it was a moment of national triumph, a healing of wounds that had divided families and communities for decades. For Europe, it marked the disappearance of the Iron Curtain. For the Cold War, it represented a symbolic victory of democracy over dictatorship. Yet reunification also brought challenges. The economic cost of integrating the impoverished East, lingering cultural divides, and debates about Germany's role in a changing Europe. Still, the event was celebrated worldwide as proof that walls could fall, nations could heal, and the dream of unity could be achieved. Even as Eastern Europe freed itself from Soviet domination, cracks within the Soviet Union itself widened. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika intended to strengthen socialism, instead unleash forces that threatened to tear the USSR apart. Glasnost encouraged public debate and criticism, which quickly turned into demands for greater political freedoms and independence among the USSR's many nationalities. From the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, to the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Central Asia, nationalist movements surged. Perestroika, meanwhile, disrupted the Soviet economy without producing growth, leading to shortages, inflation, and frustration. Factories slowed, store shelves emptied, and ordinary citizens lost faith in the government's ability to deliver even basic necessities. The Soviet Empire, already weakened by the costly war in Afghanistan and economic stagnation, now faced centrifugal forces pulling it apart. By 1990, several republics had declared sovereignty, openly defying Moscow. Within Russia itself, a new leader, Boris Yeltsin, emerged as a powerful rival to Gorbachev. Yeltsin advocated radical reforms, free markets, and full democracy, appealing to those who believed Gorbachev's cautious approach was failing. The unraveling of the Soviet Union was not just political, but cultural. People across the USSR began rejecting communist ideology, embracing religion, nationalism, and Western consumer culture. The once mighty superpower was crumbling from within, its unity dissolving under the weight of reform, resistance, and economic collapse. As the Soviet Union weakened, hardliners within the Communist Party and military grew alarmed. They feared Gorbachev's reforms had gone too far, undermining the authority of the state and threatening the survival of the USSR itself. In August 1991, just as Gorbachev was preparing to sign a new treaty that would give more autonomy to the republics, a group of conservative officials launched a coup d'etat. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his dacha in Crimea, declared a state of emergency, and attempted to roll back reforms. But the coup quickly faltered. In Moscow, massive crowds defied the coup plotters, rallying around Boris Yeltsin, who famously stood atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building and called for resistance. The image of Yeltsin, fearless and defiant, became a symbol of the people's determination to reject a return to dictatorship. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed. Gorbachev was restored to power, but the event fatally weakened him. The Communist Party's credibility was shattered, and Yeltsin emerged as the dominant figure in Russian politics. More importantly, the coup accelerated the breakup of the Soviet Union. Several republics declared independence immediately after the failed takeover, unwilling to remain part of a system that had tried to crush freedom. By December 1991, the USSR ceased to exist, replaced by independent nations and a new Russian Federation under Yeltsin. The coup attempt, meant to save the Soviet Union, instead sealed its fate, marking one of the final and most dramatic moments of the Cold War. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union, once a global superpower that had rivaled the United States for nearly half a century, was on the verge of collapse. After the failed August coup earlier that year, the Communist Party's authority disintegrated, and republics across the USSR rushed to declare independence. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, had already broken away, while Ukraine, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and others soon followed. The old empire was crumbling piece by piece. On December 8, 1991, leaders from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly in the Belovezha forest and signed an agreement dissolving the Soviet Union and creating the Commonwealth of Independent States, CS. Days later, more republics joined. Gorbachev, who had tried desperately to hold the Union together through reform and compromise, found himself powerless. On December 25, 1991, he resigned as president of the Soviet Union, acknowledging that the country no longer existed. That evening, the red Soviet flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the tricolor of Russia. The moment was both symbolic and profound. The Cold War's central adversary was gone. For millions inside the former Soviet Union, the collapse brought both hope and hardship. Hope for democracy and independence, but also hardship as economies collapsed, corruption spread, and uncertainty loomed. For the world, it marked the end of an era that had defined global politics since 1945. The Soviet Union's dissolution was not just a political event. It was the end of the Cold War itself, closing a chapter of history filled with rivalry, fear, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the global balance of power shifted dramatically. For the first time in modern history, there was no rival to challenge the United States on a global scale. The U.S. emerged from the Cold War as the world's sole superpower, with unmatched military, economic, and cultural influence. The American economy, already dominant, accelerated in the 1990s through technological innovation and globalization. U.S. military power was unrivaled, as demonstrated in the Gulf War of 1991, when a U.S.-led coalition swiftly expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait. American values of democracy, free markets, and human rights gained new prominence worldwide. Some proclaimed this moment as the end of history, suggesting that liberal democracy had triumphed over all alternatives. NATO expanded eastward, welcoming former Warsaw Pact members into its fold. For many in Eastern Europe, aligning with the West was both a security guarantee and a path to prosperity. Yet the unipolar world also raised questions. Without a major rival, would the U.S. exercise its power responsibly, or would it act unilaterally? Could the international system remain stable without the balancing effect of bipolar competition? For the moment, however, the 1990s appeared to belong to America. The Cold War had ended not with nuclear war, but with the peaceful, if chaotic, dissolution of one superpower, leaving the other at the pinnacle of global leadership. Although the Cold War officially ended in 1991, its legacy continued to shape the world in profound ways. The decades-long rivalry had left behind vast stockpiles of nuclear weapons, fragile international institutions, and deep political scars. In Russia and the former Soviet republics, the transition from communism to capitalism was turbulent, marked by economic collapse, inequality, and the rise of oligarchs. Many Russians felt humiliated by the loss of superpower status, a resentment that would later fuel nationalist politics. In Eastern Europe, however, the collapse of communism opened the door to democracy, economic growth, and integration into the European Union and NATO. Globally, the Cold War had redrawn borders, fueled proxy wars in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and shaped entire generations' worldview. The ideological struggle between capitalism and communism influenced culture, science, technology, and even space exploration. The Cold War also left behind lessons: the danger of unchecked arms races, the importance of diplomacy, and the resilience of people striving for freedom. In the United States, the Cold War fostered both triumph and trauma. Triumph in the victory of liberal democracy, trauma in the memories of Vietnam, McCarthyism, and constant fear of nuclear war. As the 1990s dawned, the world looked different, freer in many places, but still uncertain. The Cold War was over, but its shadow lingered. Its legacy remains visible today in geopolitics, security policies, and the very architecture of the international system. It was not just a conflict between two superpowers. It was a defining era of the 20th century whose consequences still ripple through history. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created 15 newly independent republics, each struggling to define its future. While the moment was celebrated as liberation from authoritarian control, the reality for millions of people was far more complicated. Economically, the transition from centrally planned system to market capitalism was chaotic and brutal. In Russia, under President Boris Yeltsin, shock therapy reforms were implemented in the early 1990s to rapidly privatize industries and liberalize prices. Instead of prosperity, these reforms triggered hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few powerful oligarchs. Ordinary Russians saw their savings evaporate, wages go unpaid, and public services collapse. Crime and corruption flourished, creating a sense of lawlessness in the new Russian Federation. Other post-Soviet states faced similar turmoil. Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and others struggled with economic instability, ethnic tensions, and weak political institutions. In the Baltic states, however, reforms were more successful, eventually paving the way for integration into the European Union and NATO. Beyond economics, the social consequences were profound. Millions of people who had grown up as Soviet citizens suddenly found themselves with new national identities, often amid disputed borders and rising nationalism. In places like the Caucasus, this led to violent conflicts, such as the wars in Chechnya and Nagorno-Karabakh. The post-Soviet era was therefore a paradox. It brought freedom and independence, but also hardship, uncertainty, and disillusionment. The struggles of the 1990s left deep scars that continue to influence politics and society across the former Soviet space today. In the 1990s, as Eastern Europe embraced democracy and capitalism, many former Warsaw Pact nations sought to join NATO, seeing membership as both a security guarantee and a symbol of integration with the West. For countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, NATO membership promised protection from future Russian aggression and a permanent place in the Western Alliance. In 1999, these three nations officially joined, followed by others in the 2000s, including the Baltic states. For the West, NATO expansion was presented as a way to consolidate democracy and stability in Europe after the Cold War. But in Russia, this process was viewed very differently. Many Russians across the political spectrum felt betrayed. They recalled assurances given in the early 1990s, though never formalized, that NATO would not expand eastward. To them, the alliance's move into former Soviet territory looked like encirclement and humiliation. Even reformist leaders like Yeltsin warned that NATO expansion risked creating new divisions in Europe. As Russia's economy and political system weakened, its resentment grew. This sense of betrayal would later be exploited by leaders like Vladimir Putin, who came to power in 1999 promising to restore Russia's strength and resist Western dominance. Thus, NATO expansion, while stabilizing Eastern Europe, also planted seeds of mistrust that would shape the post-Cold War relationship between Russia and the West. The echoes of this decision continue to resonate in international politics today, showing how the Cold War's end did not erase old tensions, but instead transformed them into new forms of rivalry. The end of the Cold War reshaped the international system in ways that were both hopeful and uncertain. With the United States as the lone superpower, the 1990s were often described as a unipolar moment. American cultural, military, and economic influence spread across the globe, from Hollywood movies to Silicon Valley technology to U.S.-led military interventions. The ideals of democracy, free markets, and globalization seemed ascendant, with many predicting that liberal democracy would become the universal system of governance. The United Nations gained renewed importance, intervening in conflicts from the Balkans to Africa, often with U.S. support. Yet this new order was not without challenges. Regional conflicts erupted in places like the former Yugoslavia, where ethnic wars in Bosnia and Kosovo revealed the fragility of post-Cold War peace. In the Middle East, the Gulf War of 1991 showed U.S. military dominance, but also foreshadowed future entanglements. Meanwhile, China, though still authoritarian, embraced market reforms and began its rapid rise as an economic power, foreshadowing a new challenge to American primacy. For Russia and many post-Soviet states, the new global order felt like exclusion. The triumphalism of the West and the hardships of the 1990s left deep resentments, ensuring that the Cold War's end did not mean the end of rivalry. Still, the 1990s brought unprecedented global integration as trade, technology, and communication connected the world more than ever before. The post-Cold War order was thus both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of one great struggle and the uncertain start of a new era in international relations. The Cold War was not only fought with weapons and diplomacy, it was also waged in the realm of culture, art, and media. Both the United States and the Soviet Union understood the importance of winning hearts and minds, using cultural production as a form of soft power. In the West, Hollywood films, popular music, and television shows carried messages of freedom, prosperity, and individualism. Movies like Dr. Strangelove or The Hunt for Red October dramatized nuclear fears and espionage, while science fiction films often mirrored Cold War anxieties about invasion and control. Jazz musicians toured Eastern Europe under U.S. sponsorship, showcasing American creativity and improvisation as symbols of freedom. In the Soviet Union, culture was tightly controlled by the state, with art and literature required to serve socialist ideals. Propaganda celebrated workers, soldiers, and the superiority of communism, while Western influences were often censored. Yet Soviet citizens eagerly sought out contraband Western music, jeans, and movies, seeing them as glimpses into a freer world. The space race itself was as much cultural as technological. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin and astronaut Neil Armstrong became global icons, embodiments of national pride. Sport was another key arena. Olympic Games became proxy battlegrounds for ideological superiority, with boycotts, doping scandals, and fierce competition adding drama. Even today, the Cold War's cultural impact lingers. Spy thrillers, nuclear paranoia, and East-West rivalries remain central themes in film and literature, while the arts of the Cold War era shaped how generations understood freedom, oppression, and survival in a divided world. One of the most far-reaching impacts of the Cold War was felt in the developing world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where superpower rivalry played out in proxy wars, revolutions, and foreign aid. Both Washington and Moscow sought to expand their influence by supporting governments, movements, and insurgencies. In Africa, newly independent nations became battlegrounds for ideological competition. The US and USSR provided weapons, advisors, and money to rival factions in Angola, Mozambique, and the Congo, often fueling prolonged civil wars. In Latin America, the U.S. supported anti-communist dictatorships and paramilitary groups, while the Soviets and Cuba-backed leftist movements from Nicaragua to El Salvador. The result was decades of violence, repression, and instability that left deep scars still visible today. In Asia, the Cold War turned into devastating conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, where local struggles were amplified by superpower intervention. Yet the Cold War also brought development aid, as both sides sought to win allies by funding infrastructure, education, and health programs. For many nations, Navigating between the superpowers led to the creation of the non-aligned movement, led by figures like India's Jawaharlal Nehru, Yugoslavia's Josip Broz Tito, and Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. These leaders tried to chart independent paths, resisting domination by either bloc. The developing world thus became both a victim of Cold War rivalry and an active participant in reshaping global politics. The legacies of these struggles, conflict, authoritarianism, and uneven development, remain central to many regions' histories even decades after the Cold War officially ended. Although the Cold War formally ended in 1991, its influence continues to shape international relations and conflicts in the 21st century. Many of today's geopolitical tensions trace their roots to Cold War divisions. In Europe, NATO's eastward expansion and Russia's sense of betrayal have contributed to renewed confrontation, most dramatically in the conflicts involving Ukraine. In the Middle East, Cold War alliances and arms flows shaped the region's political map, leaving behind authoritarian regimes, proxy rivalries, and unresolved disputes. In Asia, the Korean Peninsula remains divided, with North Korea's nuclear program a direct legacy of Cold War confrontation. Even the rise of global terrorism after the Soviet-Afghan War was influenced by Cold War policies that armed and trained fighters who later turned their anger against the West. Beyond geopolitics, Cold War-era technological advances laid the groundwork for today's world. The internet, satellite communications, and much of modern computing grew out of military and scientific research driven by Cold War competition. Similarly, space exploration, revitalized today with new global players, owes its origins to the US-Soviet race to the stars. The enduring shadow of the Cold War lies in how it reshaped the way nations view security, ideology, and global leadership. While the bipolar order ended, the habits of rivalry, suspicion, and strategic competition remain alive. In many ways, the Cold War never completely disappeared. It transformed into new forms of conflict, reminding us that history's echoes are long and powerful. The Cold War ended not with a cataclysmic battle, but with the quiet collapse of one of its principal actors. Unlike earlier conflicts in history, there was no single peace treaty or decisive victory on the battlefield. Instead, it unraveled through economic weakness, political reform, and the power of popular movements demanding freedom. The Soviet Union, once a superpower capable of challenging the United States militarily and ideologically, fell apart under the weight of its contradictions. Mikhail Gorbachev's attempt to reform socialism through glasnost and perestroika opened the door to forces he could not control: nationalist aspirations, democratic demands, and economic failure. In Eastern Europe, courageous protests, from Poland's Solidarity movement to East Germany's demonstrations, brought down regimes without Soviet intervention. The revolutions of 1989 showed that authoritarian systems could collapse when people stood united and when the superpower propping them up lost the will to use force. For the United States and the West, the Cold War ended as a triumph of democratic capitalism, but it also left lessons about humility. It showed that wars of ideology are not won through weapons alone, but through the appeal of freedom, prosperity, and self-determination. Perhaps the greatest lesson was the value of restraint. Despite nuclear weapons, humanity avoided global destruction because leaders, even amid rivalry, understood the catastrophic consequences of direct war. The Cold War ended peacefully in the sense that the worst-case scenario never happened. That in itself was one of the greatest victories for human survival. The Cold War was defined by the shadow of nuclear weapons. From Hiroshima in 1945 to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the world lived under constant fear that a single mistake could end civilization. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, seemed terrifyingly irrational, yet paradoxically, it created a kind of stability. Neither side dared to strike first because it guaranteed their own annihilation. The arms race led to tens of thousands of warheads being built, enough to destroy the world many times over. Yet out of this terror came an equally powerful recognition. Survival required diplomacy. Treaties such as the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, 1963, SALT I, 1972, the INF Treaty, 1987, and others represented moments when superpowers stepped back from the abyss. Leaders like Kennedy, Nixon, Reagan, and Gorbachev discovered that dialogue, even with enemies, was essential. The Cold War thus left behind a legacy of arms control and international agreements that remain vital today. It also left the sobering truth that humanity cannot uninvent nuclear weapons. The Cold War showed that diplomacy, trust building, and communication, such as the Moscow-Washington hotline established after the missile crisis, are as critical to survival as military strength. For future generations, the lesson is clear. Technology can bring destruction faster than politics can adapt, so the pursuit of peace must always move just as quickly. The Cold War may have ended, but its nuclear legacy still demands vigilance, reminding us how fragile human civilization truly is. Though the Cold War officially ended in 1991, its impact continues to shape the 21st century. The division of Europe, the rise of NATO, the unresolved conflicts in Korea, and Russia's uneasy relationship with the West all trace their roots to this era. Many modern flashpoints, Ukraine, North Korea's nuclear program, tensions in the South China Sea, are shadows cast by the Cold War's unfinished business. Beyond geopolitics, the Cold War transformed science, technology, and culture. The space race gave humanity satellites, GPS, and the moon landing. The arms race accelerated computing and communication technologies that later became the backbone of the digital age. In culture, the Cold War inspired literature, cinema, and art that reflected human hopes and fears in a divided world. More profoundly, the Cold War was a struggle of ideas. Freedom versus repression, markets versus command economies, individual rights versus state control. While communism collapsed in the Soviet form, its ideals and critiques of capitalism still echo in debates today. The Cold War also taught the world the value of resilience. Whether of Berliners enduring a blockade, Hungarians and Czechs resisting Soviet tanks, or Americans questioning their leaders during Vietnam. Its story is not just about superpower rivalry, but about the billions of ordinary people whose lives were shaped by fear, hope, and the dream of a better future. The Cold War remains one of history's greatest dramas, an era that reshaped nations, defined generations, and still whispers lessons to our present. In the end, it was not only a story of conflict, but also of survival, reminding humanity that even in the darkest times, peace and change are possible. And that brings us to the end of this Cold War journey here on History Teller YT. Over the past 2 hours, we've traveled from the ruins of World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall, from the fear of nuclear annihilation to the collapse of the Soviet Union. We've seen proxy wars in Asia, revolutions in Europe, and the race for space. Above all, we've seen how ideas, freedom, justice, equality, power, can shape the destiny of entire nations. The moral of this story is clear. The Cold War was not just about weapons or politics. It was about choices, choices made by leaders, choices resisted by ordinary people, and choices that brought the world back from the brink of destruction more than once. It reminds us that peace is fragile. freedom is priceless, and history is always alive. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe to History Teller YT for more powerful stories from the past. Because history is not finished. It's still shaping our present. And together, we'll keep uncovering it. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and remember, history always has something to tell us.